Thank you. So for the next hour or so, we're going to transition a bit and focus more on the environmental and land use impacts of data centers. So to start off, I just want to, again, thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and if all of them could introduce themselves and share a bit about what they focus in and how they're going to contribute to today's panel.
Hi, my name is Brigitte Meyer. I am a staff attorney at Penn Future. We are a statewide environmental advocacy organization that we do work in legal advocacy, community advocacy, lobbying the General Assembly, all kinds of good stuff. I am based in the Poconos, and my focus personally is on the intersection of land use, like local land use and local regulation and environmental concerns. And so I do a lot of work in providing resources and information to local municipalities as well as community members who are looking at engaging with local land use processes. And a lot of that recently has been related to data centers. And it just so happens I was also recently elected as a township supervisor in my own township, so now I get to experience this from both sides.
Good morning, everyone. You've already heard from me, but in case you weren't here, my name is Frank Tamulonis. I'm a partner with Blank Rome in the Energy, Environmental, and Mass Tort Group. For about the last year or so, I've been advising various data centers on various transactions, including in due diligence, permitting, regulatory, and compliance issues. So I'm happy to address some of the environmental aspects of data centers.
Hi, everybody. My name is Wemhoff. I am in the Department of Mechanical Engineering here at Villanova. I'm a professor there. I'm also a faculty within the research center that Al Ortega leads regarding energy-efficient data centers. And my particular role has evolved over the years, and now my primary focus within that center is predicting and mitigating the environmental impacts of data centers.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alice Solomon. I'm an associate at Barley Snyder, and I focus on environmental and real estate law. I've been assisting clients with all phases of data center development, from initial land use and zoning considerations all the way through environmental permitting, and representing clients before administrative agencies. And I'm also a Villanova alum, so I'm happy to be back and excited to talk with you all today.
Thank you. So to start off, we wanted to start a bit broader and kind of introduce everyone to the issue. So what environmental concerns most commonly arise when data centers are proposed?
I can say, at least from a local regulation perspective, top concerns are, concerns of the community include power consumption, which ironically is not really something that can be regulated at the local level. But then there are also concerns about water usage is a big one, and also just the sheer size of some of the proposals we've seen, looking at taking hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of land and converting it from a forest, a field, or whatever into essentially an industrial complex. So that's what we are seeing as far as when these come into communities, what people are most sort of up in arms about.
Yeah, no, I agree. Those are the big ones. Land use, I think water and energy, no question. At the local level, you'll get some of the typical local concerns, noise, traffic, lighting, things of that nature. You might get some NIMBY concerns, the not in my backyard, saying we don't mind having it here, we just don't want it right in that location, move it down the road. You might get more philosophical opposition, which is we don't want it here and we don't want it anywhere. So sometimes as a project proponent, you have to distinguish who you're dealing with. Is it someone who's just flatly against it, or is it someone who just doesn't want it at that particular location? Water consumption is a big issue, more so, I would say, in the arid states. Pennsylvania is fortunate. We have a lot of water resources here, and even though those are being strained in some circumstances, in some states where you have less water and you're relying upon groundwater for cooling, you have concerns about groundwater depletion. And taking a step up beyond the local issues, the energy consumption, that can be broken down into a couple different concerns. Ratepayers are obviously concerned about their bills. And usually you have interest groups that are concerned about climate change and greenhouse gases. That's a whole other separate issue that we can get into, but I would say, generally speaking, those are the concerns.
Yeah, I feel like Brigitte and Frank hit on all the main points. Though there's a couple things that kind of popped in my head listening to them. One is because we've been already throwing out new acronyms today. We have a Beyonce. Frank alluded to those that don't want any data centers being built anywhere, and there's actually I heard a term for that called banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. So there's that. But one other thing I'll throw out there that I think was a concern. I'm not sure how big of a concern it is moving forward, but it'll be interesting to kind of keep tabs on, is regarding the impact on the power grid, more from the standpoint of the fact that in the artificial intelligence large language model training algorithms, you have rapid fluctuations in the use of the equipment itself, and that can actually disrupt the grid. And reading through some of the data center industry magazines, there was a power outage in Spain a year or two ago. And I think some people may have thought that could have been a contributor to it. What the data center industries are doing now in these AI factories is using large battery banks to mitigate these large fluctuations. So we'll have to see if this solves the problem permanently or if this is something that needs to be kept on top of going forward.
You all mentioned the community opinion a bit in your answers. I was just wondering, how does community opposition typically shape the zoning, permitting, sitting of these data centers? Does it have a direct impact on the outcome, or is it more just a vocal opposition?
I can speak to that. So having attended several public hearings before municipalities, whether it's the Planning Commission or the Board of Supervisors, they're always having to balance the interests of their constituents with their obligations under the municipality's planning code in Pennsylvania to guide the development of various projects within their jurisdiction. So it's an ongoing challenge, and I don't think there's clear answers on exactly the extent to which each township or municipality is going to handle the pressures from residents' concerns with avoiding exclusionary zoning, which is, not allowed, and it's an ongoing tension.
I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time telling people about is kind of the point at the process where it is most effective for community members to make their voice heard effectively, because it's not at the point where they think it is. Most community members will get activated and concerned when they hear about a specific proposal that's happening, in their backyard, in their neighborhood. The reality is, by the time that you have somebody who's proposing a plan, like they've presented land development plans to your municipality, the legal landscape is kind of baked in at that point. So at that point, your local officials are going to have to make decisions based on the law that exists at that time. There's kind of common misconception that if you get 100 people in a room and they all say, we hate this thing, don't do it, then the local officials can say, well, never mind, you can't do this because everybody hates it. Everyone here who is a lawyer or who is hoping to be one in the future should know about due process, and that's actually kind of the due process problem. We have laws so that people know that what they're going to do is lawful ahead of time, and it's not kind of subject to a community vote on a case-to-case basis. So the point at which the community voice, pro, con, whatever, is most effective is actually on the front end, when you have these local communities writing the ordinances that are going to govern this development if and when it comes. So I spent a lot of time going around telling people, don't wait until somebody shows up with a proposal to have an opinion on how it's going to look in your community. Start talking about it now before anyone shows up, because the point where you have the most voice and the most control is in getting those ordinances in place that are going to govern the use if and when it happens. That was my PSA, thank you.
Yeah, I would say community opposition definitely can heighten the scrutiny. And I can give you a couple different examples. One, I'm working on a data center out in the Midwest. And unfortunately there, the opposition turned violent, which is, you're not seeing it everywhere, but you're seeing it in isolated pockets. There was some stoning of some of the construction workers and so forth. I don't think, certainly you can never condone that type of opposition. All that said, it did get the attention of IDEM, who's the state regulator out there, and it's a site that is being remediated and then constructed on, like many of these sites. It's a brownfield site. And as a result of all the public opposition and the scrutiny, they are being required to remediate it to a much higher standard than they would otherwise be required under the law. Regulators, I think elected officials do tend to get nervous when all of a sudden you're at a public comment meeting and it's a packed room. They're going to look at plans a lot more closely. They're going to afford people due process to voice their opposition. And it can result in more stringent permit conditions. For example, if a permit is appealed, and regardless of whether you litigate it or you settle it, sometimes the result is a much more stringent permit than you otherwise would have had. And so that usually begins at the beginning with community opposition, putting in comments to a proposed application or a proposed permit during the application phase. And then you see that carry through into the permit and through litigation. You can get conditions. I would say the likelihood of stopping a project altogether or overturning or invalidating a particular permit is probably relatively low, but you can impact the conditions that affect that permit. So I think it can definitely make an impact.
And just jumping off what Frank said, for some of these projects, the time factor is a big issue. So if you just to handle an appeal of a permit, it could be in the millions of dollars per day that the company is just kind of sitting on while that process takes place. So that's one other factor to consider, the time value of money involved in the project.
And that's a good point. I think the part of the reason or results of that is I'm starting to see more and more of these projects being canceled because of the community backlash or community resistance. One example that's local is up in Conshohocken here. There was an old mill that they were going to convert over to a data center, and the community there pushed back against it, and the project, I believe the project just got canceled.
And just to add, I think this just happened yesterday or maybe the day before, but there was a application for rezoning that was denied. I think it was Talon Energy had an application up in Montour County. What's that?
Archbold?
Maybe, I'm not sure. But it was submitted in August. There was a lot of community opposition, and that was denied. So it'll be interesting to see how they react, whether they double down or try to find another site. But as I understand it, it was for a large amount of acreage adjacent to their power plant up there. So, it would have been ideal, but if you can't get the zoning, that's certainly going to be a big hurdle for them to cross.
Regarding some of these permitting issues, what planning tools, data, or information do you believe that municipalities are typically missing or not considering enough when they're reviewing these proposals for a new data center?
I think one challenge that municipalities have is just the resources that it takes to evaluate potential land development plan. These can be really large projects, and just having like the engineering consultants involved to review the plans can be pretty substantial. So one thing I've seen is requests from municipalities that the developers provide the funding for all of the review or the initial review, including the cost that the township's going to incur to take that on.
I can tell you from the engineering point of view, there are a lot of tools. There's no one universal standard tool to predict the power and water consumption of data centers. It's been an ongoing effort by a lot of different parties. There are a lot of consortia out there that of folks within the data center industry and trying to come up with standards or predictive ways to determine what that power and water consumption would be. And that process is still evolving right now.
Yeah, and to echo what Alice said, a lot of these projects are happening in rural areas of Pennsylvania, small townships where, the township building might be the same place where they park the snowplows. And so when you get a big project like this coming, I worry literally about the infrastructure. I mean, do they have the space to handle it? I can recall being part of a public meeting when we were participating or assisting with Shell's petrochemical facility out in Monaca, Pennsylvania, and there were hundreds of people there, and they had to rent auxiliary space and buses to bus people up. I mean, they didn't have the physical infrastructure to handle that type of, that volume of people, but also the technical expertise. I mean, the staff who may already be short-staffed to begin with are going to be tasked with reviewing some highly detailed technical proposals, whether it's land use plans or local permitting. I can tell you we deal with this at the DEP level. When you're dealing with some of the more remote regions, they may be short-staffed to begin with. Sometimes they ask us for help in responding to public comments and things like that because either it's a staffing issue or it's a technical expertise issue. So, I think another question kind of related that you had is what advice might you have for the municipalities? And it goes along with this question. My advice is to make sure that you either hire or retain an engineering firm or make an arrangement whereby the company covers those costs, and just to make sure that you're prepared for the onslaught and that you're not misguided by misinformation, because there's going to be a lot of misinformation, whether it's from the industry side or the special interests, and so you need to know the facts and you need to educate yourself and be prepared for the scrutiny.
Yes, I will definitely co-sign these. Sometimes we are looking at this happening in municipalities that are just not prepared, even space-wise. I was involved in a hearing last year where not only they had to move to a larger venue because the township building did not fit anywhere near as many people as wanted to show up. They also didn't own a sound system in the municipality, so they had to borrow one from a wedding venue. It had all these flashing lights that would go off on it. It was great. But also as someone who I am working mostly on helping municipalities get prepared on the front end, the issue a lot of times is that this is a type of development that is relatively new at this scale in Pennsylvania, so we don't have a lot of examples to look at from ordinances that have actually been applied and how it works and how what doesn't work, what exactly to expect, how big of a thing should we be planning for, how much concern should we have about water withdrawal, to what extent do we really need to be drilling down on regulating that, and to what extent is that maybe not something that is going to be so extreme that we need to go full bore on 14 pages of ordinance language. So that is a big challenge that municipalities are facing. And also we have 2,560 municipalities in Pennsylvania. something like close to 1,000 of them have fewer than 1,000 residents. Your like local officials are volunteers. They have full-time jobs. Like in my township, one of our supervisors owns a towing company. So we're not necessarily talking about people with the technical expertise or the time to gain the technical expertise to really dive into this stuff. So I definitely advocate for getting experts involved, like everyone else said.
One other point, just jumping off the other points that have been made, there's also an open question of what standards should apply and whether, if those standards don't currently exist, the municipalities have the authority to impose those standards, or whether that's going to be an area for state or federal regulation. So there's also this kind of open question about whether some of these decisions that are currently being made at the local level are going to be preempted with some legislation that's out there right now.
Yeah, water withdrawal in particular is kind of like this almost no man's land regulatory-wise in some ways.
I know earlier you all mentioned some common concerns that these data centers are causing within the environment, specifically with the water infrastructure and the land use issues. I was wondering if you could all explain more for everyone what pressures these data centers are putting on the water infrastructure and what issues the data centers are specifically causing regarding land issues for everyone who may not be aware.
I can speak for the waterfront. There was a study that came out a year ago that kind of gave the broad number, and you see this actually at some of these community rallies opposing data centers, is the 5 million gallons per day of water consumption by data center, of really large scale, gigawatt scale data centers, which is about the consumption of a small town. And what's concerning is that if you have a small community with an existing infrastructure to serve the water to the data centers, or to serve that community, adding a data center can severely disrupt that infrastructure. So that water consumption, all this discussion here was about the disruption on the power grid. The water infrastructure as well can be severely affected in these small communities. So that's something that needs to be taken into account.
In my experience with the data centers that I've worked on, when it comes to water withdrawal, they're supplying their own infrastructure to make sure that the water gets from the source, whether it's a surface body or a groundwater production well. And then with respect to discharges, those are usually going into another, sometimes the same body of water, and are regulated by a NIPD's discharge permit. But an issue, aside from water withdrawals, that we've run into is with respect to sanitary wastewater, because that does rely on the local municipality. And again, you're constructing these oftentimes in small townships and rural areas. And I saw a picture of the local wastewater treatment plant where our project was expecting to go to. And it was just a cinder block building with a couple tanks and a rusty metal roof that needed repair. And it did not have the capacity or the engineering capability to take on additional volumes. And data centers don't traditionally employ a lot of people. I mean, your average data center is employing between 30 and maybe up to 100 people, but that doesn't take into account hyperscaled data centers or data center campuses where then you are talking about hundreds of people. And so this comes up with respect to municipalities' Act 537 sewage planning. It's just another crunch point, and I would say on the scale of crunch points that data centers face, this is probably lower on their list. But it's another issue, and it's putting great strain on the local infrastructure, and they got to figure out a solution.
One thing I'll add is there is a bit of an issue within the data center industry in terms of reporting their water consumption. There has not been as much of that, not nearly as much of that as you've seen on the power consumption front. And I know that there's a push within the industry to try to have a little bit more transparency about that.
As data center development accelerates, Do you believe that there's a mismatch between like the pace of development and the ability for these local governments and the infrastructure of it all to keep up with these developments?
I think when it comes to local governments, there's kind of two components, and on one hand, there is like the literal ability to keep up, capacity-wise. There's also kind of a gap we see a lot in just understanding that they need to keep up, that, the best time to take action is before you see this development, like have something in place. I guess we haven't discussed in any detail Pennsylvania and the rule against exclusionary zoning. So for everyone who's not a Pennsylvania-specific land use attorney in the room, we have this kind of unique rule in Pennsylvania that it is actually, in almost all cases, unlawful for a municipality to completely zone out any legitimate land use. So you don't have the option of saying, we don't want a data center here, you can't build it here. You have to provide for that in some way in your zoning, and the trick is if you don't do that, somebody who wants to build a data center or really any other kind of use can bring like a specific kind of legal challenge your zoning ordinance, and if they win that challenge, they kind of get to build the thing wherever they want to build it. Like, this is a super simplified version of this legal principle, but and essentially the local government loses the control over where things are sited. So if you don't want that to happen, you need to get out ahead of things and create a zoning ordinance that allows for data centers somewhere. So municipalities should understand this, but a lot of times, like I said, these are volunteers and they're responsible for a lot of stuff. Like the same people are responsible for, creating zoning ordinances and making sure that the roads get plowed and the grass gets mown in the parks and that the fire department is functioning in such a way that, if stuff catches on fire, it gets put out. So a lot of times the thing that's not like right in front of them at that moment gets pushed to the side, but then suddenly the thing's right in front of them and it's too late. So we at Penn Future are trying to provide the resources to make this easier, but a lot of times it's an issue of local officials understanding that, they need to get on this yesterday. I think that answered the question. I don't know.
Any idea where we can get a model ordinance?
I have one, yes. If you go on Penn Future's website, you can find the model ordinance for data center uses that I myself drafted, and I'm actually working on updating. So also, if anybody knows a sound engineer or acoustic engineer, please contact me, because apparently regulating sound is very complicated and involves math that I have not seen in at least 25 years.
I guess on the infrastructure side, I could say that the answer was kind of addressed in the earlier panel. They talked about how data centers are actually being built in certain locations and they're just waiting for the grid to catch up. So I think that kind of answers that. The answer would be yes on the infrastructure side, at least in certain places.
How do you all think that, like when we're discussing data centers and the land use and environmental issue with it all, do you think this is more like traditional industrial uses or energy infrastructures, or something distinct that we should think about when we're discussing these data centers?
It probably depends on the scale of the project that you're talking about. So in the prior panel that we talked about the different types of data centers, and some of them can fit within a building and they're just designed for that one user. But for the hyperscale data centers, they're going to look more, at least from a land development side, like maybe a warehouse or another large industrial facility in terms of, just developing the land. But for the long-term use of that facility, that's where things can really vary in terms of the energy input and water usage that's going to be required.
Yeah, data centers are kind of a unique animal, I think, and they do vary. Some are co-located with power generation, so you might have your typical, natural gas or coal or nuclear generation co-locate it with the data center. It might be a data center campus. But so then you have sort of a mixed use. You have a large power generation facility, and you have data centers. And that's, you can't really regulate it in the regular way that you might regulate your typical power generation facility, because there's additional concerns associated or considerations associated with data centers. I used to think that these things were sort of a blip on the radar. I mean, who's going to want to build these huge, gargantuan things that suck up all this water and energy so we can scroll on our reels on Facebook or on Instagram and look at, fake videos? There's a lot more to it than that, and as the professor pointed out early on, there's an economic component, there's a national security component, and make no mistake, I think most folks in government want these data centers. Pennsylvania wants data centers to be here. They're competing against other states. The United States wants them in the country. We're competing against China and others. It's a race, an arms race in many ways. It's maybe one of the few areas where Democrats and Republicans could actually see it eye to eye. The president has issued a series of executive orders seeking to streamline the regulation and the permitting of data centers. So has Governor Shapiro. And just a couple days ago, he released what he calls his grid policy, which is intended to streamline the permitting process and expedite the permitting process, provided certain criteria are met. It's called the Governor's Responsible Infrastructure Development Program. And to get back to actually your last question, you were talking about, is the pace of development outpacing the ability of local governments to sort of keep up with it? And if I can just expand that to not just local governments, but also state governments, I actually think the answer is no, because although you are seeing, local municipalities and DEP regions, and maybe the EPA being inundated with requests, there's a lot of changes that are happening pretty rapidly in response to this, and the permitting process itself is very onerous. I mean, if you're co-locating with a generation facility, you got to get a Title V air permit. That takes a lot of time. In terms of water permits and approvals, you got to get a water withdrawal approval under 316B of the Clean Water Act. You got to get a NIPDES discharge permit. You got to get a NIPDES stormwater permit. If you're in the eastern 2/3 of Pennsylvania, you got to get approval from the DRBC, from the SRBC, and that's on top of all the local approvals and zoning approvals. So it is a complex regulatory scheme, and it's a years-long process. And it gets held up by litigation, a permit appeal, a zoning appeal. Your project timeline goes from 2 to 3 years to 4 to 5 years real quick. And so that, I think, is allowing time for us to sort of adjust the regulatory scheme. But what you're not seeing, in my opinion, is things getting a lot more burdensome. You're seeing efforts by both states and the federal government to sort of streamline the process, provided you're hitting certain benchmarks. So that's sort of a long-winded answer to your last question. I don't know if it addresses your current question, which I currently forget what it was.
We're touching on kind of I guess, changes that are being made within local, state, federal governments, and obviously we all know that this is a very rapidly growing industry. I was wondering if you guys believe that the data centers are adequately addressed under existing zoning land use frameworks, or where you see that progressing to in the next year, 2 years, 10 years or so?
I mean, like I just said, the short answer for zoning frameworks is a lot of municipalities is no, they haven't addressed it at all, which is a problem due to the exclusionary rule that we just talked about. I think the existing authority that municipalities have as far as local land use goes, I think we're good there. Municipalities can regulate this. It's just on a municipality to municipality basis, they just have to go ahead and do it. So it depends if, if you're asking, is your particular municipality's zoning scheme adequate to address this? In many cases, no. So if you live in a municipality that has not addressed data centers, please contact your local officials and tell them, get on the ball.
I think there are also some municipalities who are eagerly welcoming in data center development, maybe depending on the types of resources they have available there. Maybe they have nuclear power plants available there for providing the energy, or maybe you have the complete opposite where the municipality is very hesitant and doesn't want to see any of that development. So it really depends how quickly that ordinance is going to move through based on the local appetite for that development.
And we've been really focusing exclusively on Pennsylvania, but data centers are popping up all over the place. And there are some states that have little to no local zoning. And what you're seeing with some companies is they're sort of doing a forum shop, and they're trying to find those states, and I'll name Texas as being one of them, where you don't really have much by way of local zoning. So there's probably a lot of catch up to do in those states. Here in Pennsylvania, I agree there might be some amendments to do, but at least there's, in most counties and townships, you have a pretty advanced zoning scheme. I mean, I mentioned the Talon project up in Montour County that was just recently denied its rezoning application. There is legislation being proposed right now that is directing the creation of sort of a model ordinance that addresses issues like siding, noise, setbacks. But as was mentioned multiple times here, you got to be careful because zoning is not a ban on legitimate uses. You can regulate where it goes. You can include certain setbacks from residential areas, from riparian areas, but you cannot exclude entirely a legitimate land purpose. So I think there's efforts at the state level. Environmental groups are trying to come up with model ordinances that might pass muster and not fall subject to the exclusionary principle.
And the last question before we open it up to everyone, do you believe that data centers should be treated differently from other large-scale developments under land use or environmental law?
Well, there are aspects of data centers that are comparable to other uses, and in those cases, it's perfectly fine to treat them the same as other uses, like lighting, parking, landscaping. There's not really a huge difference between a data center and just any other extremely large box use. So like existing zoning or subdivision and land development ordinances that address those kind of things are often adequate. But then there are other uses where data centers are kind of unique, so we have to start looking at creating new ordinance regimes that address the specificities of data centers. So we haven't really talked a lot about noise, but data centers not only are kind of somewhat uniquely noisy, but there's also kind of a unique character of the noise that's not addressed adequately by the kind of ordinances that we usually see that are designed for, like your neighbors having a loud party. That's a different kind of noise than a data center, and we don't currently see a lot of ordinances that are addressing that appropriately. Really one of the big things that makes data center unique is the power consumption, and that's actually out of the hands of local regulation, so that's not something that we worry about. And then the water piece is kind of like a weird, in-between thing, so some municipalities might be looking at regulating that, but then there's also the SRBC, that's the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, the Delaware River Basin Commission. So it gets complicated at that stage.
I guess the short answer is I don't think they should be treated differently than other similar types of facilities. The issue is that there's not a lot of other extremely similar type of facilities. They're sort of a different animal. But there's going to be unique challenges. I think that there already is a heightened level of scrutiny, just given all the public attention and political attention. That said, I think as much as possible, they should be treated the same and equitably under the law, and you take each project like you would any other project on a case-by-case basis, and you assess what the risks are, what the impacts are, and then they should be permitted appropriately. I don't think that they should be singled out for any necessarily harsher treatment. I just don't think that would be appropriate.
Well, I can't speak from the legal standpoint. I can talk about from the engineering standpoint, and of course they are unique from the engineering point of view because of this, the intensity of power and the power and density, the amount of power used per square foot within these facilities. There are consortia out there of engineers that are trying to put together recommended standards for data centers. One of the most prominent one that has developed some standards is called ASHRAE. I don't know if you've heard of them. It's American Society for Heating, Refrigeration, Air Conditioning Engineers, and they've just established standards on power consumption for data centers with the thought that there's certain techniques within the cooling systems that have to be employed in order to achieve those standards, to meet those goals. I don't know whether they'll be adopted on the legal end, but at the very least, there's a push to come up with some engineering calculations that come up with some recommended metrics for data centers to follow.
Thank you. Does anyone from the audience have any questions?
My name is Knox Ross. My role here is I'm Jimmy's dad. I'm from Mississippi, you can't tell, but I was a small town mayor for 16 years. I was president of the Mississippi Municipal League. I have a question and a comment on this. This has been absolutely fascinating work. And the first thing I would say is this exact panel needs to desperately be sitting in front of the next Pennsylvania League Municipality meeting. Tell these people, because they're all tow truck drivers, they run the local shoe store or whatever, they don't know. They don't know what you're telling these people, because all they're seeing is somebody's coming into town and saying, we're going to put a data center, and you're going to get all this money. It's going to be great. And it's just like when they told you we're going to legalize liquor, it's going to be great. Like the lottery, it's going to be great. And you understand what I'm saying? Is it going to tell you it's great? And then you're left with all the things that you all talk about and the previous kind of talked about all the politics. The question I really have is there any thought from a Pennsylvania standpoint with the utilities and the economic development organizations in trying to create certified data center sites that have been vetted, much like we do with large-scale industrial sites, that you go in, we know the gas is there, we know the water's there. Because what I'm watching in Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas is that data centers are being built very large. Meta is building one of the largest ones in the world in North Louisiana on a bunch of farmland, Richmond. There's nobody there checking on either. It's south of Monroe. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of investments going on there. And I doubt anybody's asked very many of these questions. And so what happens in 15 to 20 years when you pump out all the water and you've got all these things that are there? Is there any thought of that where the state is looking at, right, data centers are real. They're a good thing, but they're not a good thing everywhere. Where is the best place, given our resources that are there, that we can locate these, go ahead and get ahead of this, so you don't have big mobs of people coming in like you're talking about and pitchforks and torches, then we don't want it. Because, corporate America, they want something certain. They don't want to have to deal with that. So if they already know that yeah, we can build this here, and the locals are good with it. I mean, is there any thought of doing that? And like I said, you guys need to be sitting in front of the municipalities like whenever their next meeting is, because this is terrific information.
So to answer the first part of your question, there is pending legislation that would create a siting board that would say, part of what you said, these are sites that we believe are the appropriate area for that development, and it would preempt local regulation of where the data centers would be sited. And there's also efforts, I don't think we've discussed this yet, but regional planning efforts by municipalities to join together and figure out within this region, where should this use go? And that kind of gets to the point we made earlier about the exclusionary zoning could come up there. And just touching on one other point, decommissioning is another thing that I think was raised by your question. There's estimates that the technology that's involved with these facilities may become obsolete within, a certain 10, 20 time year period. So what obligations might the developer have to ensure that all that technology is properly disposed of, and what do you do with the existing structure?
I'll give you an answer that's more from it's more of a broad engineering research point of view, so it doesn't get into the legal aspects of pointing out sites in a particular state. But what I can say is that some of the work that I've been working on for the last, 10 years, 15 years, has been looking at where could you ideally put a data center if the only consideration was water and carbon footprints. We can look at where exactly they should be, because you can take into account that maybe if it's a cooler climate, then you could incorporate that cold air into helping to cool the data center, so you don't need as much electricity for that. Or perhaps there's plentiful water resources available so that you don't have to consume what's scarce in that region. And so there's been some research done in that area, and if you're curious, the answer probably is somewhere in like the Pacific Northwest is a good area. And there's, then depending on what your goals are, if minimizing carbon or minimizing water, there's other parts of the country as well that are good places to build data centers.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention the legislation that Alice mentioned. I know that that's out there. It's proposed with respect to pre-selected sites. I imagine there'll be a lot of debate on that. I don't know how that would work. The board selects these pre-selected sites. I would assume they would look at things like, is it close enough to water resources? Is it close enough to energy resources? Does it have the proper zoning, or can it get the proper zoning? But what assurances would the companies that are going to invest have that that pre-selected site would not be subject to separate challenges by neighbors or the community or environmental groups? I don't know that the state can give those reassurances. And what's to stop a company from using a site that's not selected under assuming the risk of additional potential challenges? So I just have a lot of questions as to exactly how that would work, what kind of assurances and protections the companies would get if they do use a pre-selected site. But it's being debated at the legislature. So to answer your question is, yeah, they're having that conversation.
I can reassure you that the organizations that serve the municipalities, like the Municipal League, I know has upcoming the next edition of their magazine for their members is entirely devoted to data centers. Myself and a coworker contributed an article, and also we have the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors. They have an upcoming conference in April, which I believe has several sessions devoted to data centers, which I assume will be very well attended. And I guess also from touching on the proposed legislation, there's a lot of resistance to that from the municipalities and the organizations that represent them, just because we have such a tradition of local control of land use in Pennsylvania. So this kind of thing, there's kind of a knee-jerk reaction to it. Like I personally am not opining on whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, but I know it's facing a lot of headwinds just because the municipalities are used to having that local control, and they don't want it to go away.
One other unique aspect of Pennsylvania law is that we have within our Constitution an Environmental Rights Amendment, which requires the government to take a look at the environmental impacts of the various actions that it's taking. And that's also kind of an open question as to whether, if this legislation goes forward, how that might, spawn litigation over whether that's depriving, the government of its obligations to consider the environmental impacts, including at the local level.
I don't need a microphone. Aaron, you and I recently collaborated on a proposal, and one of the facts that I learned as we were putting together that proposal that I wanted you to speak about briefly is the interesting interaction between where the data center gets its energy and where water use happens. So can you talk a little bit about that, about sort of, you kind of know what I'm talking about.
Sure, yeah. So in the sustainability world, we have these terms called Scope 1 and Scope 2. Scope 1, basically when you refer to water, it's basically how much water is being used by the data center on site. And that seems to be the primary focus of the industry as well as the communities that are looking at data centers. However, I think it's important to also consider Scope 2. And Scope 2 is basically the water that's embedded within the power used by the data center. So in other words, if you build a data center, say in Villanova, Pennsylvania, it's drawing some of that draws its power from a number of sources, and it takes water to generate the electricity that is then used by that data center. And so you can see that's a property of where the data center is located within the electric grid. And so to get a full picture of the holistic water footprint for operating that data center, you need to include not only what's being used on site, but also what's used upstream within the power grid. And as a result, it may be a little bit surprising is that you could have so-called waterless data centers where they don't use any water on site. They may actually have a larger water footprint than if you were to include water consumption on site. Because in essence, what happens is, in general, if you apply evaporative cooling within your cooling system, yes, you're using water, but at the same time, you're more than likely going to reduce your power consumption, which means there's less upstream water.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today.